Is China copying the make work programs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR's New Deal programs? So I have this article up. It's old. It's from the Foundation for Economic Education, and it explains for those of you who are not familiar with what the New Deal was and what the make work programs were. It was basically a Keynesian ditch digging central planning effort by FDR, although Herbert Hoover did do it to a smaller extent as well with his interventionist and central planning economics. But basically tens of billions of dollars, which in the 1930s was a lot of money back then, tens of billions of dollars were spent, and they claimed it did a good job. But in hindsight, in 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, confirmed the total failure of the New Deal and the make work programs. They spent, an enormous amount of money, and basically unemployment levels, maybe they temporarily dropped, but they still spiked after that. They went right back up to very high levels, and that was when the government was more honest. So as for those of you who are familiar with my work and my background, I tend to look at a lot of current events and things happening in markets from a historical perspective. And so basically, in my opinion, thinking about this a lot more, a lot of what China is doing now with this One Belt, One Road program, it reminds me of these make work programs from New Deal and the 1929 Great Depression that the U.S. Programs that the U.S. implemented after the October 1929 stock market crash that President Herbert Hoover initially did, and then FDR and his tinkerers, a lot of whom hated capitalism and were hardcore socialists and central planners, some of them were even Marxists, they implemented. And so China is doing this One Belt, One Road program, and they've committed to spending over $1 trillion on, infrastructure projects in other countries. And in my opinion, I think a lot of these investments, and I'm using air quotes, are not going to pay off in fruition. So maybe Chinese fake GDP will make it look good, and maybe some of these other countries will temporarily have jobs. But I think, in the whole scheme of things, President Xi and other people in the Chinese Communist Party are allocating this capital to get a lot of adult male Chinese who could potentially start a political revolution or be rabble rousers out of the country. So they're giving them jobs, they're giving them some type of hope, they're putting money in their pocket, they're saying, oh, we're going to improve China's economy in the long run. But, some of the investments that are going into some of these other countries are not really gonna provide a lot of economic benefit for these other countries. There's not a lot of good potential long-term economic upside in some of these countries where the investments in that one belt, one road economic infrastructure program are going. So they're basically going to be, train stops with bullet trains or things like that. They're not going to be that productive. It's going to be very similar to Keynesian ditch digging, but on a larger scale. And so, a lot of that money could end up being wasted. But meanwhile, President Xi is consolidating power. For those of you who haven't noticed, it looks like he's about to completely eliminate term limits and switch over what was, a sham of a voting democracy with, one party over there into basically no voting at all, with unlimited term limits for himself and anyone he appoints, or anyone in his family or his crony friends and party loyalists and things like that. So the other thing about China that I wanted to connect, and maybe the thing about make works projects is that it distracts a lot of men, in my age demographic who would be unemployed, who in the past, during the Great Depression could potentially have caused a political revolution either in the United States back during the Great Depression or in China now. And so, there are a lot of red flags in China despite what the economy is supposedly booming. China is in right now the happy part of a credit boom. So it could go on for years more, but things are beneath the surface. There's a lot of red flags. So first, some of the red flags are the head of the People's Bank of China may resign in the near future. He's already been talking about Minsky moments for the last 6 months and talking about China reaching its credit limit. And yet, when we look at the news stories for China, the things that are happening, things are starting to get crazy. Just last month, a record 2.9 trillion yuan in new loans in 1 month, an explosion of new loans. enormous, enormous explosion. And then the People's Bank of China released nearly 2 trillion yuan in temporary liquidity. That was just earlier this month. And so on top of this, nothing has really collapsed in China yet. There's been some warning things, whether it's China shutting down its VIX to halt market turbulence, or the other two main things that people are seeing now, and Zero Hedge has been covering this more than a lot of other places, is the Anbang. So China, Zero Hedge has been talking about Anbang insurance for well over a year, a bunch of stories. I tried to open up a bunch of different tabs showing the news stories, and my computer was running really slow, so I couldn't open up all these tabs for this video, but there was literally a dozen of these Anbang stories and HNA stories over the last 12 to 18 months. So there's a lot of red flags here that things are getting pretty bad. So we don't know for sure if the combination of HNA and Anbang are going to be China's version of AIG, China's version of Lehman Brothers, China's version of Bear Stearns. We don't know yet if that's going to be the case, but there are a lot of red flags. And one of those red flags also happens to be that HNA Group was a very large shareholder in Deutsche Bank. And for years, a lot of people in the alternative financial community have talked about all the problems in Deutsche Bank going back for 15 or 20 years with their over-the-counter derivatives book from Bankers Trust that Deutsche Bank bought. Basically, they were suckered into buying that, and they didn't know all the unfunded liabilities that they would have that were in the trillions. And so, Citibank, I think German regulators forced Citibank, forced Deutsche Bank to sell some of those derivatives to Citibank in the last 12 to 18 months. But Deutsche Bank is basically a zombie bank and is still holding a lot of these liabilities. And you guys have seen a lot of these news stories out about HNA Group. And HNA Group is liquidating real estate holdings. They're asking their own employees for emergency loans. That's another red flag there too. So they're liquidating assets, and then they're claiming that they still want to be a long-term shareholder for Deutsche Bank. But it looks like that HNA Group was used after the 2008 financial crisis to help provide emergency bailout money for Deutsche Bank. Rather than central banks continually publicly announcing that they were giving all this money to Deutsche Bank, they found other people to inject liquidity or capital into Deutsche Bank. Although secretly, covertly, in my opinion, I've been talking about this for a couple years now, I think the European Central Bank and possibly the Federal Reserve, with currency swaps, central bank level currency swaps, and intervention into markets, have kept Deutsche Bank alive instead of collapsing. So there is, beneath the surface, there is a lot of problems in China. And despite this, China may have really high GDP for now. I just saw a statistic on Twitter from Marin Katusa. He posted this, that China had a record amount of copper demand in the last 12 months. So I think 2.6 billion pounds of copper, record amount. But in my opinion, a lot of that copper demand, I think, is artificial. So I think it's based off of central planning. It's not based off free market copper demand. It's based off, China spending all this money on construction projects that may or may not be used, may or may not be economic in the future. So what do you guys think about all this about China? Do you think, how close do you think China is then to having potentially, with HNA Group and Anbang Insurance, to having potentially its Bear Stearns moment, its Lehman Brothers moment, or its AIG moment? Because China is very opaque. We do know that the People's Bank of China has publicly released some of their balance sheet. I did videos on this last year, and they stated that they have 220 trillion in RMB, liabilities, which translates to around $40 trillion, almost 40 trillion US dollars in liabilities. So China really, in the last 10 years, they were in better shape from a financial standpoint. Their government was, in terms of no credit bubbles, in terms of not a huge debt problem. They were in much better shape 10 years ago. They had around $4 trillion in reserves in U.S. treasuries and dollars to invest, and they were investing in commodities and buying gold. And basically in the last 10 years, they've had an unprecedented amount of explosion in credit in their real economy and from their banking system, their shadow banking system. And so China is definitely a mess. There's a lot of red flags, but we don't have any obvious signs quite yet when something's going to collapse, especially when, as I've been mentioning this for a long time now, that governments can change the rules. And this is really easy to do in China, because look at how Anbang Insurance was nationalized. And so the Chinese government right now is claiming that Anbang will only be nationalized for a year. But come on, guys. We all know that governments tend to lie about stuff like this. Do you really think that this insurance company, this large insurance company, will only be nationalized for a year? I really don't. I really don't trust the Chinese government, the U.S. government, or really any government at this point. And so what do you guys think then about this One Belt, One Road program that China is doing? Maybe some of the investments in infrastructure into other countries, connecting Europe to China. A version of the Silk Road on the land will be good, but I think there's going to be an enormous amount of waste there. And I think, there's an ulterior motive, like I said, that China is not announcing publicly, and that is to make sure that they are really worried that they do not have low unemployment levels. Because if the people in China, especially men in my demographic or younger, adult-aged men, are not employed, do not have food, they will strike, they will protest. They will potentially, go to pitchforks and start violence like Tiananmen. And so governments doing these type of central planning, Keynesian ditch digging, make work projects, which may just load the government balance sheet with debt, may not be economic at all, may actually cost an enormous amount of money. If you read this article that I have on the screen here about the failure of the New Deal program and the make work projects, you'll understand more about what I'm talking about. Although if you just search New Deal program, you'll see the spin from all the regular American historians and all the regular economists and a lot of the hardcore Democrat websites that worship FDR as a god, that these programs, these New Deal programs and the Make Work projects were all a good idea and all did a good job, which is not really true. Especially when you have FDR's former Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, admitting that they were a disaster and a failure. So very interesting to see what happens in China, but it looks like China is copying and taking it to a whole nother level, an order of magnitude larger, the New Deal programs, the Make Work projects with this One Belt, One Road. So maybe some of it will be somewhat economic in the very, very long term for China, but I think there's going to be an enormous amount of waste there, an enormous amount of corruption there, and an enormous amount of fraud there. So share your thoughts about this, and history doesn't always repeat completely. I think I've tried to stress this, but it does rhyme. And it seems that the planners in China who are worried about all the problems beneath the surface in China are really trying to focus on making sure that a lot of their Chinese citizens have jobs, have food on the table, so they don't go for political revolt and political revolution. So share what your guys' thoughts on this. I'm going to work on getting out more content for the rest of the week. I have an interview with Jeff Deist, who is president of the Mises Institute. That interview is recorded already. It's just being edited, so hopefully that will be released soon. I'm going to be interviewing Nolan Watson of Sandstorm Gold again to talk about gold miners and how his company is well positioned for the future. It's a totally different company than it was even a couple years ago. And so we'll talk about that. And then finally, last thing is, how many of you guys who listen to this podcast regularly, how many of you guys are going to be in DC this weekend for LibertyCon? So if you guys want to meet up either at the conference or have a drink around DC, if you're going to be in town for the conference at the hotel, or maybe you want to meet up and we'll have a podcast listener dinner or something somewhere around the hotel, or a drink or something like that, let me know. Because, I really enjoy meeting a lot of you guys in person. Obviously, I haven't done a lot of traveling as much as I'd wanted to for a while now, but hopefully in the near future that will change. But if you're going to be at LibertyCon coming up this weekend here in Washington, D.C., should be a fun conference, a lot of big name guest list. And I'll be there as well, so hopefully I'll get to meet some of you guys in person. Okay, bye for now, guys. Do you work out routinely and eat healthy almost all the time? If you eat paleo or vegan or work out routinely, you may be eligible to save up to 33% off on your life insurance thanks to Health IQ. Health IQ is a venture capital-backed, big data technology life insurance company that offers customers life insurance at special rates by using the latest technologies. For more information, please go to healthiq.com/WS4MS. That's healthiq.com/WS4MS.